The mysterious call. It was a quiet day in the vast galaxy. Stars sparkled in the darkness. Planets revolved around their suns, and all seemed peaceful. But peace can be deceiving. Something was about to break the calm, something that would send shockwaves through the galaxy. It started with a mysterious signal. At first, it was barely noticeable, a faint echo in the dark reaches of space. Just another random message. No one could say for sure. But then it repeated, over and over. Someone, or something, was trying to get the attention of the universe. The signal came from an uncharted part of space, a region known for its emptiness. Few ships had ventured there, and fewer still had returned. It was a place that many in the galaxy have forgotten, a place where danger hid in every corner. But now, this empty, forgotten region was sending a call for help. At the center of a massive space station, the leaders of the galaxy's most powerful factions gathered. They were there for a summit, but the signal changed everything. An emergency meeting was called. The message had been intercepted by an advanced network of sensors and was immediately decoded. What was found was chilling. The message was from the peaceful alien race known as the Filler. They had lived for centuries in peace, never involved in the galaxy's conflicts. Their world, a lush and vibrant planet, was now under attack. The Filler had always been known for their intelligence and tranquility. Their cities were filled with knowledge, their technology advanced, but they never had the need for war. They were the very image of peace in the galaxy. And now, they were in danger. The unknown enemy attacking them was relentless, and it was clear that they could not defend themselves. The message was brief but powerful. Help! Our people are dying. We cannot stop them. We are on the brink of extinction. Please, someone, anyone, come to our aid. The leaders of the galaxy were shocked. The Filler had always kept to themselves. They had never asked for help before. And now, they were desperate. But who could respond? Who could help them? Across the galaxy, different factions debated. Some said it was too risky to send help. The unknown enemy could be more dangerous than anyone imagined. Others feared that the Filler had brought this upon themselves, that they had provoked the attack. But there was one faction that did not hesitate. The Deathworlders. The Deathworlders were a terrifying group of warriors, known for their ruthless efficiency and ability to survive in the most dangerous environments. They came from worlds where survival was not a matter of choice, but of strength. The Deathworlder Fleet had been called upon many times before, and each time they had emerged victorious. Their reputation was built on courage and survival. They had faced the deadliest creatures, the most powerful armies, and the harshest conditions. Nothing could stop them. They were the last resort, the force that could turn the tide when all else failed. And so the call went out. The Deathworlder Fleet would respond. But who would lead them? The leader of the fleet was a legendary figure, known throughout the galaxy as a master tactician and a warrior without equal. His name was Captain Kale. He had led the Deathworlders through countless battles, always emerging victorious. His reputation was unmatched, and now he was faced with his most difficult challenge yet, saving an entire alien race from destruction. Captain Kale received the message in his command center. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from the screens that filled the walls. His officers stood around him, waiting for his decision. The message had been clear. The Filler were in danger, and they needed help. But this mission would not be easy. The unknown enemy had already proven itself to be ruthless and powerful. Captain Kale knew that it would be a fight to the death. "We have no choice," Captain Kale said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "We will respond to their call. The Filler are not just another species. They are part of the fabric of this galaxy. We cannot let them fall." As the fleet entered the Filler system, the first sign of trouble appeared. A strange energy signature flashed on the sensors. It was the enemy. They had already begun their assault. The Deathworlders had arrived just in time. The fleet prepared for battle. The time for questions was over. The Deathworlders were about to show the galaxy why they were the last hope in times of darkness. The Filler's plea for help had been answered, and the battle for their survival was about to begin. His officers nodded in agreement, knowing that once they left for the Filler's planet, there would be no turning back. They would face unimaginable danger. They would risk everything to save the Filler. The Deathworlder fleet prepared for battle. Ships of all shapes and sizes filled the dark spaceport, ready for the journey ahead. These were no ordinary ships. Each one was a fortress, equipped with the best technology the galaxy had to offer. They were built for survival, built for war. As the fleet lifted off, Captain Kale stood at the helm of the flagship, his gaze fixed on the stars ahead. He knew that the enemy they were about to face was unlike any they had encountered before, but the Deathworlders had faced worse. They had fought on the deadliest worlds, against the most terrifying creatures, and they had always won. The journey to the Filler's planet was long, and the tension on board the fleet was thick. Each crew member knew that they were about to enter the unknown. The Filler's planet was surrounded by strange phenomena, anomalies that even the most seasoned explorers avoided. The fleet would have to navigate through them, all while keeping their focus on the battle ahead. The Deathworlder Fleet. The silence of space was broken only by the hum of engines and the steady beat of anticipation in the hearts of the Deathworlder Fleet's warriors. They were a fearsome sight, their ships the epitome of strength and battle readiness. There was no mercy in them, no weakness. Every member of the fleet had survived on planets where danger was a constant companion, and they had learned to live in the most hostile of environments. These were the Deathworlders, the galaxy's most feared warriors, and now they had a new mission: to save the Filler. The Deathworlder fleet was not like any other military force in the galaxy. Unlike the sleek, technologically advanced ships of the more peaceful factions, the Deathworlder ships were built to endure, to survive, and to strike back with overwhelming force. They were designed for brutal efficiency. Each ship had a history of battles won and enemies defeated, their hulls scarred by countless skirmishes with creatures, armies, and natural disasters. These ships were like living beings, as much a part of the Deathworlders as the warriors themselves. Captain Kale stood at the helm of the flagship, the Vanguard, watching as the fleet slowly moved through the dark void toward the Filler system. His face was calm, but inside, his mind raced. The galaxy knew him as a master tactician, someone who had led his fleet through some of the most brutal and dangerous conflicts the galaxy had ever seen. But this mission was different. He wasn't just fighting for survival or glory. This time, he was fighting to protect an innocent people. The Filler had never been involved in conflict before. They were a peaceful species. They didn't deserve to be destroyed by some unknown, merciless enemy. The captain's voice cut through the tension on the bridge of the Vanguard. "Prepare for hyperspace jump. We'll be entering the Filler system in 10 minutes." The crew moved quickly, their movements precise and practiced. They didn't speak much. Deathworlders didn't need to. Every member of the fleet knew their role and carried it out with deadly focus. There was no room for mistakes here. If they failed, the Filler would be wiped out, and the Deathworlders would have lost their honor. The fleet exited hyperspace, and the Filler system unfolded before them. A beautiful star system with a peaceful blue planet at its center. The Filler's home world. But there was something wrong. The once serene planet was now under a dark cloud, an ominous shadow that cast a long, foreboding presence over it. The peaceful world was now a war zone. "I don't like this," said one of the officers, his voice filled with unease. "There's a strange energy around the planet. It's like something's blocking our sensors." Captain Kale didn't respond immediately. He was too focused, too sharp to be distracted by uncertainty. He knew the moment they had arrived, they would face whatever force had attacked the Filler. And he knew they had to be ready for anything. "This is what we trained for," Kale finally said. "We move forward. Engage all shields, weapons at the ready. We'll clear the way for the ground forces to land." The vanguard led the fleet as they approached the planet. Around them, the other ships followed in perfect formation. Their weapons were primed, their hulls bristling with deadly firepower. As they neared the planet, Captain Kel's thoughts turned to the filler. What kind of enemy would threaten such a peaceful race? And why now? Suddenly, the quiet was shattered. A sharp, high-pitched scream rang out over the communication channels. The first strike came from nowhere. Massive, fiery projectiles hurtling through space toward the fleet. They were fast, too fast to avoid. But the Deathworlders had prepared for this. The fleet moved as one, the ships shifting into defensive formations. Plasma shields flared to life, protecting the fleet from the oncoming barrage. The enemy was here. The vanguard rocked violently as one of the fiery projectiles struck its shield, but the shield held firm. Captain Kale was unshaken. Return fire. Target the enemy ships. Focus on their weapons. The battle had begun. A massive fleet of unknown alien ships appeared out of the shadowed clouds surrounding the filler world. They were nothing like anything the Deathworlders had faced before. Sleek and menacing, these ships had a strange design, with sharp angles and unnatural curves. They seemed to blend into the darkness, as if they were a part of the void itself. But despite their strange appearance, the Deathworlders knew one thing for sure. They were an enemy that needed to be stopped. Enemy ships inbound. All ships, open fire, Kale commanded. The Deathworlder ships unleashed a storm of laser fire and missiles. The battle became a symphony of destruction, explosions lighting up the void as the Deathworlders clashed with the unknown enemy. The enemy ships fought back fiercely, launching devastating energy blasts that shook the Deathworlder fleet. But the Deathworlders were relentless. Their training, their strength, and their tenacity kept them on the offensive. No matter how powerful the enemy's attacks were, the Deathworlders responded with equal ferocity. On the surface of the filler world, things were just as chaotic. The Deathworlders had deployed ground forces to defend the filler, but the enemy's ground forces were equally vicious. The Deathworlder soldiers, armed with advanced weapons and powerful armor, clashed with the enemy on the planet's surface, fighting for every inch of land. The filler, who had once lived in peace, now watched in horror as their world was turned into a battlefield. Captain Kel's face remained as calm as ever as he watched the chaos unfold on his command screen. We will not let them fall. We will not let them suffer. As the battle raged on, the Deathworlder fleet fought with everything they had. Their ships were strong, their soldiers fierce, and their determination unwavering. They had answered the call to help the filler, and they would see this mission through to the end, no matter the cost. The enemy might have been powerful, but the Deathworlders were something else entirely. They were survivors. And in the end, that was what would make all the difference. The filler's enemies had made a grave mistake by underestimating the Deathworlder fleet. They would learn soon enough that when the Deathworlders came to the rescue, there was no hope for the enemy to survive. The mission briefing. The vanguard was still shaking from the impact of the enemy's attack. The battle had been intense, but it was only the beginning. Captain Kale stood tall on the command deck, his gaze fixed on the glowing holographic display in front of him. His crew, though battle-hardened, had never faced anything like this before. The unknown enemy was relentless, and their technology was unlike anything they had encountered. The filler were counting on the Deathworlders, and Kale knew that their survival depended on every decision he made from here on out. The bridge was quiet, the usual chatter replaced by the hum of machinery and the occasional beep from the communication systems. Kale's officers moved swiftly, but with a sense of urgency, knowing that their next steps would determine the fate of the filler. They had arrived just in time, but time was running out. Report. Kale's voice cut through the silence, steady and commanding. Lieutenant Zara, a veteran officer known for her sharp instincts, stepped forward. Sir, the enemy's main force has been identified. They're using a mix of advanced energy weapons and cloaking technology. We've had minimal success tracking their ships, and our usual targeting systems are being jammed. Cal's mind raced. The enemy was powerful, stronger than they had anticipated. But that didn't change anything. They had a job to do, and they would see it through. Any weaknesses? Cal asked, his voice calm but tinged with the sharp edge of determination. Zara hesitated for a moment, her eyes scanning the data on the screen before her. There's a pattern to their movements. They're using a cloaking field that makes it nearly impossible to track them accurately. But we found a small disruption in their field when they launch attacks. It's brief, but it's enough to get a lock on their ships. If we can exploit this weakness, we might have a chance. Cal nodded. Good. We'll need to work fast. Time is not on our side. He turned to his other officers. Prepare the fleet. We'll be launching an assault in 2 hours. I want every ship ready to move and every crew member focused. This is going to get worse before it gets better, but we will not fail. We've faced worse odds before. We've survived the worst that the galaxy can throw at us, and we will do it again. The crew responded with a firm, "Yes, sir," as they scattered to their stations, each one knowing their role in the coming battle. The atmosphere on the bridge was heavy with tension, but beneath it, there was also a sense of purpose. This was the mission they had been trained for, the mission that would either make or break their legacy. Cal's mind, however, was already deep in thought. The enemy's technology was far superior to anything they had faced before, and the cloaking field was an entirely new level of challenge. But he had faced worse. The Deathworlders were no strangers to danger. They thrived in it. If anyone could overcome this, it was them. Suddenly, a new message came through the communication system, a direct transmission from the filler. It was their leader, a calm and collected figure known as Eulora. Despite the dire situation, there was a sense of serenity in her voice as she spoke. "We are grateful for your arrival, Deathworlders. But I must warn you, the enemy you face is not one we have ever encountered. They have conquered entire civilizations, and their weapons are devastating. I fear we are already too late." Cal's expression hardened as he listened. The filler's fears were not unwarranted. This enemy had already proven its power by attacking the filler without mercy, but Cal was not a man who would back down. He had been in countless battles, each one more dangerous than the last, and each time he had led his fleet to victory. "We will not let you fall," Cal replied, his voice firm. "You may not have the strength to fight, but we do. We will give everything to protect your world. We will not leave until the enemy is destroyed." Eulora paused before responding, and when she did, there was a quiet gratitude in her voice. "I will relay your words to my people. We trust you, Deathworlders. Our survival is now in your hands." The transmission ended, leaving Cal with a heavy heart. He knew the filler had placed their trust in them, and he couldn't afford to fail. But failure was not an option. The Deathworlders had never failed. Not once. And they wouldn't start now. Turning to his officers, Cal spoke again. "We are facing a ruthless enemy, one that doesn't play by the rules. They're fast, they're strong, and they have technology that could wipe us out. But we are Deathworlders. We don't follow the rules. We make them." He looked each of them in the eyes, his gaze unwavering. "We're going to hit them hard. We'll use their own technology against them. We know their weakness now. We'll exploit it, and we'll strike before they have time to retaliate. We will not give them a chance to regroup. We will fight with everything we have." His crew, already on edge, now stood taller, their faces set with grim determination. They had fought together many times before, but this time was different. The stakes were higher. The filler depended on them, and the Deathworlders would never let them down. "We'll start by taking down their cloaking field," Cal continued, "and then we'll go after their fleet. No mercy. We'll use everything at our disposal." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle in. This mission isn't just about survival. It's about sending a message. No one threatens the galaxy's innocence. Not while we stand. Let's show them what happens when the Deathworlders respond to a call for help. A sense of unity swept through the crew. They knew the odds were against them, but they also knew they had the strength to win. They were Deathworlders, born to survive and fight. Captain Kale turned back to the holographic display, his fingers hovering over the controls. All ships, prepare for the assault. This ends now. With that, the fleet began its preparations, each member of the Deathworlder forces locking into place, ready for the most crucial battle of their lives. The mission briefing had ended, but the real work was just beginning. The Deathworlders would fight with everything they had, and they would not stop until the filler were safe. The fate of an entire race now rested in their hands. Entering the battlefield. The moment the fleet made its final jump into the filler system, the calm that had briefly hung over the Vanguard and his companions vanished. The stars and planets around them, once serene, were now shattered by the chaotic energy of battle. The filler's beautiful world, once lush with vibrant jungles and crystal-clear oceans, was now clouded by smoke and ash. The peaceful planet, home to one of the most enlightened species in the galaxy, had become a war zone. Captain Kale stood on the command deck of the Vanguard, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the scene unfolding on his tactical display. The enemy fleet, an overwhelming and unfamiliar force, had already begun bombarding the filler surface. Explosions rippled across the atmosphere, sending plumes of smoke and fire into space. The filler cities, once proud and towering, were now crumbling under the weight of the alien invaders' unrelenting assault. The entire Deathworlder fleet stood poised for action, their weapons primed and shields raised, ready to strike. The alien forces had been quick to notice the arrival of the Deathworlders, and the silence of space was shattered by the thunderous roar of weapons fire. But despite the chaos, the Deathworlder fleet maintained perfect order. Every ship, every warrior knew their place, and they had one mission: to protect the filler and drive back the enemy. Prepare for battle. Captain Kale's voice echoed throughout the command deck, steady and firm, cutting through the tension. We'll give them no quarter. Without another word, the Vanguard led the charge, followed by the rest of the fleet. The massive ships surged forward, weapons blazing. The sky above the filler planet became a battleground, filled with a symphony of laser fire, explosions, and the roar of engines as the Deathworlders engaged their enemy. The first wave of enemy ships came at them, sleek and deadly. Their weapons were powerful, firing energy blasts that could rip through shields in a single strike. Yet, despite their advanced technology, the Deathworlders were relentless. Their ships were built for endurance, designed to take hits and keep fighting. The Vanguard shuddered as the first enemy shot struck its hull, but the ship held firm, returning fire with pinpoint accuracy. The Deathworlder fleet's weapons were deadly, their targeting systems honed to perfection. Target their engines, Kale barked. Disable their ability to retreat. The Vanguard's turrets fired, unleashing torrents of plasma fire that connected with the enemy ships, causing them to stagger under the assault. The Deathworlders didn't just fight. They fought with purpose. Every shot, every strike, was calculated to weaken their enemy's resolve. It was a war of attrition, and the Deathworlders knew how to win it. Meanwhile, the rest of the fleet was engaged in fierce dogfights above the filler surface. Deathworlder ships darted through space with agility that defied their size. Their tactics were brutal and efficient. They would dive in, unleash a full barrage of firepower, and then pull out before the enemy had time to retaliate. The enemy, caught off guard by the sudden ferocity of the Deathworlders, struggled to keep up. Their ships were fast, but not fast enough to evade the skilled warriors of the Deathworlder fleet. On the surface of the filler planet, the ground forces of the Deathworlders had already landed. They were met by a storm of fire from the enemy, but they pressed forward, moving as one unit, their armor shimmering under the light of the dying sun. The enemy's ground forces were just as deadly, their soldiers equipped with advanced weapons and armor, But they were no match for the relentless Deathworlder infantry. Each Deathworlder soldier had been forged in the harshest conditions, trained to survive in environments that would break most other warriors. Now, on the ground of the filler world, they fought with brutal efficiency. "Push forward," shouted Sergeant Torek, a towering figure with a reputation for getting things done, no matter the cost. His voice rang out over the chaos, his troops responding with a roar of agreement. "We're not just fighting for survival. We're fighting for their future." The ground forces surged forward, clearing out the enemy positions one by one. They moved in perfect formation, their weapons cutting down the alien soldiers who dared to stand in their way. The Deathworlders were a storm on the ground, unstoppable, relentless, and fierce. The filler, watching from their shattered cities, could only stand in awe as these fearsome warriors moved through the battlefield like a tidal wave, leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. Back in space, the battle raged on. The enemy fleet, now realizing the full extent of the Deathworlder might, had begun to regroup. They launched counterattacks, desperate to halt the relentless advance of the Deathworlders. But Captain Kale was ready. He had anticipated this move. "Deploy the interceptors," he commanded. "We need to block their reinforcements before they can regroup." The Vanguard released a swarm of smaller ships, sleek, fast interceptors designed to protect the larger vessels and take out enemy reinforcements. These ships darted into the heart of the enemy fleet, weaving in and out of fire, their weapons blazing with deadly precision. It was a distraction tactic, and it worked. The enemy forces were so focused on the interceptors that they failed to notice the Vanguard and its fleet closing in on their command ships. Cal's eyes narrowed as he observed the chaos unfolding around him. This was the moment, the critical point in the battle. If they could take down the enemy's command ships, the entire force would crumble. Without hesitation, Cal issued the order. "Concentrate all fire on the enemy flagship." The Vanguard and the other Deathworlder ships focused all their firepower on the enemy's central command ship, the heart of their fleet. Energy blasts and missiles streaked across the sky, striking the flagship with powerful force. The enemy flagship shuddered under the barrage, its shields buckling as the Deathworlders tore through its defenses. But the enemy commander wasn't backing down. The flagship's weapons fired back, tearing through the Deathworlder ships with brutal precision. Yet the Deathworlders were not easily defeated. They absorbed the hits and pressed on. The battle was far from over, but Cal's resolve was stronger than ever. They would break the enemy's line, and they would not stop until the filler were safe. In the midst of the chaos, one thing became clear. The Deathworlder fleet had arrived, and they were not leaving without victory. The battle was about to enter its most critical phase, but for the Deathworlders, there was no such thing as defeat. They had come to this war with a single purpose: to protect the filler. And as long as they drew breath, they would never stop fighting. The battle turns. The battle over the filler world was unlike anything the Deathworlder fleet had faced before. The enemy's tactics were ruthless, and their technology was both advanced and terrifying. They had come prepared, and for a moment, it seemed as if the Deathworlders might be facing an overwhelming force. But Captain Kale and his fleet were unyielding. They had fought in the worst conditions imaginable and survived, and they weren't about to let this battle be the exception. On the Vanguard, Captain Kale stood at the helm, his eyes fixed on the chaotic scene unfolding around him. The massive battlefield stretched out before him, his fleet locked in a fierce struggle with the enemy, their weapons flashing against the dark backdrop of space. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the battle pressing down on him. But his resolve never wavered. They had come to protect the filler, and no matter the odds, they would succeed. But just as the Deathworlder fleet seemed to gain the upper hand, the enemy revealed its true strength. A sudden shift in the battle occurred when the enemy flagship launched an enormous energy pulse, unlike anything seen before. The pulse rippled through space, cutting through the Deathworlder fleet's defenses like a knife through paper. The Vanguard shuddered violently as the pulse struck its shield, and for a brief moment, Captain Cale thought it might fail. But the shield held. It was strong, but not invulnerable. "Captain, shields are at 40%, shouted Lieutenant Zara, her voice filled with urgency. Cale's eyes narrowed as he realized the gravity of the situation. This was no ordinary weapon. The pulse was far stronger than anything they had encountered, capable of disabling their shields and leaving them exposed to the enemy's next attack. "Damage report," Cale ordered, his voice steady despite the rising tension. The communications officer, her fingers flying over the controls, relayed the data. "We've sustained heavy damage to our forward shield grid, sir. We're losing power to the main engine. If we don't repair it soon, we won't be able to keep up with the enemy." Cale's mind raced. They couldn't afford to lose momentum. They had been winning, but now it seemed as if the enemy had turned the tide. If they didn't act quickly, the filler would be lost, and the Deathworlders' reputation would be shattered. They needed to find a way to counter the pulse weapon before it wiped them out. "Send out the repair teams," Cale commanded. "We'll keep pushing forward, and I want every ship to converge on that flagship. We're going to take it down." But even as Cale issued the order, something else caught his eye. The enemy fleet had begun to regroup. They were more organized now, coordinating their attacks with terrifying precision. The Deathworlders had been fighting relentlessly, but now the enemy was showing their true form, an unstoppable force designed to wear down their opponents and crush their will to fight. The filler planet below them was in ruins. The once beautiful cities, home to millions, were now nothing more than smoldering husks. The filler people, watching helplessly from their underground shelters, could do nothing but pray for the Deathworlders to succeed. Their world was being torn apart, and it was up to these hardened warriors to save them. On the surface, the ground forces of the Deathworlders were still holding strong. Sergeant Torek, the massive and imposing figure who had led the charge into the heart of the battle, was pushing forward with his troops. His soldiers were relentless, clearing out the enemy's forces one position at a time. Despite the odds, they were making progress, but the enemy kept coming. They were never ending. "We're not backing down," Torek shouted over the din of gunfire. "We push forward, no matter what." The Deathworlder soldiers surged forward, their armor shining through the smoke and destruction. The enemy's ground forces were just as vicious, but the Deathworlders were warriors to the core. They had been raised in the harshest environments and trained to fight through pain, exhaustion, and death. Every step they took was one closer to victory, and nothing could stop them. Back in space, the battle had reached a new intensity. The enemy flagship, now fully aware of the Deathworlder fleet's relentless assault, launched another devastating pulse. This time, the blast hit several of the smaller Deathworlder ships, causing massive explosions that tore through their hulls. The Vanguard was forced to maneuver quickly to avoid the same fate, and the damage to their shields was mounting. The enemy was relentless, and it was clear that they were not going to stop until the Deathworlders were destroyed. "We can't keep taking hits like this," Lieutenant Zara said, her voice tight with concern. "If we don't neutralize that pulse weapon, we'll lose the entire fleet." Cale looked out at the battlefield, his mind racing. The situation was dire. They had to find a way to take out the enemy flagship's weapon, or they would lose the battle. But how? They couldn't keep absorbing these devastating blasts. The Vanguard had taken too much damage, and the rest of the fleet was starting to show signs of weakness. Just then, Cal's eyes locked onto the screen. An idea flashed into his mind. One risky, dangerous idea. The enemy's pulse weapon, while powerful, had one flaw. It took time to recharge. During that brief moment of recharge, the flagship's defenses were slightly lowered, leaving it vulnerable. "Get me a direct line to the fleet," Cale ordered. "We're going to hit them hard." The command was sent, and the fleet's ships, despite their damage, fell into perfect formation. Cal's plan was a desperate one. An all-out assault on the enemy flagship while it was in the process of recharging its weapon. They would have one shot to take it down. If they failed, the consequences would be catastrophic. The Deathworlder fleet surged forward in unison, their weapons charged and ready. They poured every last ounce of firepower into the enemy flagship. Energy blasts, missiles, and plasma rounds struck the massive vessel, hammering it with everything they had. The flagship's shields flickered, and for a brief moment, they faltered. That was all the Deathworlders needed. Now, Kale shouted. The final volley of missiles tore through the flagship's weakened defenses, hitting the heart of its core. A massive explosion erupted, sending shockwaves through space. The flagship's engines erupted into flames, and its pulse weapon went silent. The enemy flagship was crippled, and the battle had turned once again. "Target their remaining ships," Kale ordered, his voice cold with determination. "Finish this." With the flagship gone, the enemy fleet began to crumble. The Deathworlders pressed their advantage, taking out ship after ship in rapid succession. The tide of battle had shifted, but there was no room for rest. The enemy was still dangerous, and the Deathworlders would not stop until the filler were safe. The battle was far from over, but now victory seemed within reach. The Deathworlders had turned the tide, and they would not stop until the enemy was crushed completely. The ultimate sacrifice. The once vibrant planet of the filler, now a war-torn landscape, was slowly beginning to show signs of hope. The enemy fleet, its morale shattered after the destruction of its flagship, was retreating. But the Deathworlder fleet, though victorious in their immediate objective, knew better than to celebrate. There was still more to be done. The ground forces, led by the relentless Sergeant Torek, continued their push, clearing out the remnants of the enemy forces one battle at a time. But with each step forward, it was becoming clear that victory would come at a cost. On the Vanguard, Captain Kale surveyed the battlefield, his expression grim. The battle had taken a heavy toll on his fleet. Several ships were badly damaged, and the cost of their victory had been high. Crew members, who had once been full of hope and determination, now showed signs of exhaustion and fear. The battle had pushed them to their limits, and Kale knew that, despite their success, the war was not over. The enemy forces might have been scattered, but there was still one last piece of their strategy to dismantle: their final weapon. Reports came in, one after another, showing the damage sustained by the fleet. The Vanguard had been hit harder than Kale had anticipated. The repairs were coming along, but they wouldn't be completed in time to engage in another large-scale assault. The enemy might be retreating, but they weren't gone. Kale's eyes narrowed as a new report came in. The enemy was regrouping, not in space, but on the ground. It seemed they had one last weapon hidden deep beneath the surface of the filler planet, a weapon so devastating that it could wipe out the entire planet and everything on it. "We can't let them activate it," Kale muttered to himself. The filler had placed their trust in them, and Kale wasn't about to fail them now. On the planet's surface, Sergeant Torek and his ground forces had already begun to move toward the enemy stronghold. Deep underground, in the abandoned cities of the filler, the enemy had set up a hidden facility, a massive bomb capable of destroying the entire planet. It was an insurance policy, a last-ditch effort by the invaders to ensure they left nothing but ashes behind them. Torek's voice crackled through the comms. "Captain, we've located the enemy's bomb. It's buried deep in the ground. It's heavily guarded, and we're taking fire from all sides. But we're getting closer. We just need a little more time." Kale clenched his fists. He knew that the moment Torek's team reached the bomb, they would face overwhelming resistance. The Deathworlder fleet was already stretched thin, and they couldn't afford to lose any more resources. They had to take the bomb out before it was too late. "We're with you, Sergeant," Kale responded, his voice steady. "Hold the line. We'll provide air support." The fleet's remaining ships, battered but functional, descended toward the filler world. Despite the toll of the previous battle, Kale knew they had one final mission to complete. They could not allow the enemy to destroy the planet they had just fought so hard to protect. As the Deathworlder ships provided cover, the ground forces pushed deeper into the heart of the enemy stronghold. The situation was becoming more desperate with every passing minute. Torek's squad, though fierce and trained, was running low on ammunition and morale. The enemy forces were more entrenched than they had anticipated, and the walls of the underground facility were lined with traps, weapons, and hidden enemies. "We're not turning back," Torek gritted through his teeth. "We get that bomb, or we die trying." But Kale knew that things were worse than they seemed. There was one thing the enemy had left to use, a desperate weapon that could destroy not just the Deathworlders, but the entire planet. He had kept this information from the fleet until the last possible moment. If the Deathworlders were going to stop the bomb, they would have to risk everything. As the ground forces neared the facility's core, Cal's heart raced. He didn't know how much longer the Deathworlders could hold out, but he also knew this was their last chance. They could not fail. The filler, the galaxy's innocent, had put their faith in them, and the Deathworlders would keep their word. "Sergeant Torek," Kale said, his voice sharp, "listen carefully. The bomb must not go off. Do whatever it takes to disable it. If you can't disable it, you must destroy it. You must sacrifice everything to protect the filler." There was a long pause on the comms. The static seemed to hang in the air as Torek's response came through. "We're close. We'll hold them off, Captain. But it might be too late. The bomb is already powered up. I don't know if we can stop it in time." Cal's heart clenched as the realization hit. The enemy had planned for this moment. The bomb was already primed. He looked over at his officers, his hands gripping the edge of the command table. He had one final devastating option to prevent the destruction of the filler world. "Lieutenant Zara," Kale said, his voice quieter now, filled with a grim determination. "Prepare the Vanguard for a final strike. We need to disable the facility from above." Zora looked at him with uncertainty, but she quickly understood the gravity of the situation. "Sir, the bomb is underground. Even if we fire from orbit, we'll only cause further damage to the planet. We'll need to be precise." "I know," Kale replied. "But if we don't act now, the planet will be lost." Kale knew that this was the hardest choice he would ever make. If they fired on the facility, it would take out the bomb, but it would also likely destroy the entire underground complex, possibly killing Torek and his team in the process. "We don't have a choice," Kale said. "Do it." With the order given, the Vanguard's targeting system locked on to the facility. Kale watched, his heart heavy, as the countdown began. In his mind, he could already see Torek and his team, fighting desperately to save the filler. "Goodbye, Sergeant," Kale whispered, even though he knew Torek would never hear him. The Vanguard fired its final shot, a precision strike that hit the core of the facility. A massive explosion rocked the planet. The shockwave sent a pulse through the air, shaking the surface of the world as debris and fire erupted from the underground base. For a moment, everything was still. Then the comms crackled back to life. Torek's voice came through, barely audible, but filled with the unmistakable tone of victory. "We did it, Captain. The bomb is gone. But we lost a lot." Cal's breath caught in his throat. The price had been heavy. Sergeant Torek and his team had succeeded in stopping the bomb, but at what cost? Many lives had been lost in the final assault, and the Deathworlders had given everything to ensure the safety of the filler. "We honor their sacrifice," Kale said quietly, his voice filled with pride. "And we will carry on their legacy. The filler are safe." The battle had ended. The Deathworlders had given their all to save the filler world. The cost was immense, but the victory was theirs. The filler had been saved, and the Deathworlders had proven once again that they would sacrifice anything, even their own lives, to protect the innocent. Victory and legacy. The skies above the filler world were quiet now. The sounds of battle had faded, replaced by a tense, uneasy silence that blanketed the war-torn planet. The once beautiful landscape, scared by the destruction of the enemy's invasion and the fierce conflict that had followed, was slowly beginning to heal. The fires that had raged through the filler cities were dying down, their embers smoldering in the aftermath of the epic struggle. But even in the stillness, the cost of the battle was evident. Captain Kale stood at the edge of the command deck of the Vanguard, his eyes staring out at the planet below. It was a world forever changed by the Deathworlders' arrival. The planet, which had been so full of life and hope, had been reduced to ruins. Yet, amidst the wreckage, the filler had survived. They had been saved, thanks to the relentless sacrifice of the Deathworlder Fleet and the courage of their warriors. The battle was over. The enemy had been destroyed, their weapons dismantled, their forces scattered. The Deathworlders had accomplished the impossible. They had saved the filler from extinction, and the galaxy would know their names for generations to come. But for Kale and his crew, there was little time for celebration. Their work was not yet done. "We did it." Lieutenant Zora's voice broke the silence, her words laced with a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. She stood beside Kale, looking out at the planet they had fought so hard to protect. "The filler are safe, but at what cost?" Kale didn't respond immediately. He could feel the weight of Zora's words. They had won the battle, but they had paid a terrible price. Many good men and women had fallen in the fight, including Sergeant Torek and his team. Their sacrifice would be forever etched in the hearts of the Deathworlders, but it was a burden Cal carried heavily. The galaxy had seen their strength, but at the cost of so many lives. The victory felt hollow. "Yes, the filler are safe," Kale finally replied, his voice steady but filled with a quiet sadness. "But we will never forget those who gave everything to ensure their survival." On the planet below, the filler had begun to emerge from their shelters, their eyes searching the skies, waiting for any sign of the Deathworlders. For them, the arrival of the fleet had been their last hope, a hope that had been fulfilled. The Deathworlders had come to their rescue, and now their world would remain standing. The filler leader, Eulora, made her way to the landing zone where the Deathworlders would make contact. She was the one who had first called out to the galaxy, pleading for help. Now, as she stood there, looking up at the ships descending from the sky, she could hardly believe the depth of the debt the filler owed to these fierce warriors. She had known that the Deathworlders would come, but never had she imagined the cost of their arrival. As the first ship landed, a small group of filler stepped forward to meet the Deathworlder delegation. Their faces were filled with awe and gratitude. They were a peaceful race, not accustomed to violence, and yet they had witnessed firsthand the price of survival. They had seen the Deathworlders fight with unmatched tenacity and sacrifice. Willor approached Captain Kale as he disembarked from the Vanguard, his expression somber, but his presence commanding. The two leaders stood face to face, a moment of silence passing between them. The filler leader, her voice trembling, spoke first. "On behalf of my people, I thank you," Eulora said, her words thick with emotion. "You and your warriors have given us our lives back. We are eternally grateful." Kale nodded, but the burden of the day's events weighed heavily on his shoulders. "We came because you called for help. It was our duty. But the true cost of this victory is not one that can be measured in gratitude alone." Eulora looked down, understanding the unspoken words. The filler had survived, yes, but many lives had been lost. And though they could rebuild, the scars of the battle would remain, for both the filler and the Deathworlders. "You did not come for glory," Eulora continued. "You came for us, for our survival. And for that, we will forever remember you as our saviors." Kale glanced over his shoulder, his eyes briefly meeting those of his crew. They had seen the worst of the galaxy, enemies far beyond what the filler could have imagined, but they had never once faltered in their resolve. They had fought, and they had won, but the victory was bittersweet. "We fought because it was the right thing to do," Cal replied, his voice firm. "We protect those who cannot protect themselves. That is the code of the Deathworlders." As the ceremony continued, Cal's mind wandered back to the fallen. The faces of his comrades, those who had given everything to ensure the filler's survival, flashed in his mind. Torak, Zara's old friend, and so many others who had not made it back. The names of the fallen were countless, and each one was a reminder of the price of this victory. In the days that followed, the filler began to rebuild. They restored their cities, and life began to return to the planet. The Deathworlder Fleet remained in orbit, ensuring that no further threats would emerge from the shadows. They didn't stay for glory or accolades. They stayed as protectors, a constant reminder that when the galaxy was in peril, the Deathworlders would answer the call. Captain Kale and his crew, though exhausted, knew their mission had been a success. The filler were safe. The galaxy had seen the true strength of the Deathworlders, but more than that, they had seen the heart of their warriors, unwavering loyalty, unmatched courage, and a fierce determination to protect those who could not protect themselves. As Kale stood on the Vanguard's command deck, staring out at the recovering planet, he felt a deep sense of pride. The Deathworlders had once been seen as ruthless warriors, feared across the galaxy, but now they had earned something far greater. They had earned the respect of the filler and the admiration of every corner of the galaxy that would come to hear their story. And though the cost had been great, Kale knew that this was the legacy the Deathworlders would leave behind. A legacy of sacrifice, courage, and hope. The galaxy would never forget the warriors who had come to the aid of the helpless and had paid the ultimate price for their survival. "We did our duty," Kale whispered to himself, the weight of the loss heavy on his shoulders. "And we will carry their memory forward, forever." The battle for the filler was over, but the Deathworlder Fleet would continue its mission, always ready to protect those who needed them, no matter the cost. The legacy of the Deathworlders was one of sacrifice, and they would live on as a symbol of hope in the darkest corners of the galaxy.